Thanks for coming on, Ted.
Behind door number 1?
Behind door number 2. Come on.
Where am I going here?
You're going to put your right foot down there.
Absolutely.
Here's the camera. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.
We had the ability to chat a little bit in the green room because we were pitched to have the professor on as an expert in the Affordable Care Act and everything going on in Washington right now.
It's a pleasure to be here.
How does one become an expert in the Affordable Care Act? How you must know it pretty well.
You have to read things on a regular basis, because the ground is shifting under our feet here. So I think one of the remarkable things is that the Senate and the House are both working hard on this. The House has passed a plan, the American Health Care Act. Most people are not big fans of that. And so what we're looking right now is that about 16% of the public, according to the most recent polls, thinks it's a good idea. About 48% thinks it's not, so that's still a work in progress. The Senate's hard at work at their own plan, the Better Care Reconciliation Act. And one of the things that is happening here is we're seeing a lot of activity around the budget process. Mm-hmm. Both of these bills would use the budget reconciliation process to accomplish reform.
And so you've been following it closely. You knew, obviously, when Trump became president, this was high on his agenda. Was what came out of the House, I mean, clearly working with Congress is another animal altogether, was that what you expected?
Not really. In fact, what I thought we would probably do would be something along the lines of what had previously been introduced in the Congress before, where Speaker Ryan and others had worked hard to send a bill to the President. President Obama, of course, vetoed the bill, but they actually had a template. I thought they would work much off of that template. Instead, we've gone back to the drawing board and got something new. The thing that we're trying to do here, I think, is to accomplish reform, because the Republicans have promised for 7 years that they would actually repeal this and then replace it with something new. President Trump this weekend suggested we just replace it, just repeal it. That's really problematic, because the insurance companies in particular are really depending on some type of predictability here where we know what's going to be in place, because otherwise they have a really hard time pricing their products.
So talk to us a little bit about that Ryan proposal, what that had looked like, and why that wasn't ultimately viable.
I'm not sure what the decision-making process really was that led them to abandon that approach. I think what we were seeing there was a much more market-driven approach. And I think now the focus is really on cutting back on Medicaid. That both the House and the Senate plans really focus on that. I think that's really problematic for states like Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. We have expanded Medicaid, lots of states have, and this is a real tough sell for Republican senators now who are representing states that expanded Medicaid, because that's a really difficult vote to take when you are essentially voting to take away hundreds of billions of dollars in most cases, billions in some, from states that have expanded access to care.
So you talked a little bit about your reaction to what you saw come out of the House. What was your reaction when you saw what happened in the Senate?
The Senate is a really tough, challenging environment right now. Except, the majority leader, Mitch McConnell, is really trying to build a coalition. The hard thing is that he's being pulled in two different directions. He's kind of like a political Gumby. And I think one of the things, you've got conservatives on the right trying to pull him in much more of a market-based approach. They would like to get rid of things like the pre-existing conditions protections that the Affordable Care Act introduced. That is not popular with the public, and it's not necessarily popular with a lot of the more moderate senators. So as you're trying to appease those folks, on the same time, you've got folks like Susan Collins from Maine, and she is not an easy sell on those, and she is, again, advocating for keeping a lot of those protections in place. So if you appease the moderates, you tick off the conservatives, and if you try to work with the conservatives, then the moderates on silent on. So,
well, if you're a betting man, which way do you think Mitch McConnell goes?
I think he's going to work really hard. I think that's one of the things we're seeing this week while they're in recess. He's working really hard to twist some arms to try and not so much twist arms, but to make some compromises. He's a pretty consummate deal maker. I think one of the things that I was impressed at with this past spring was the way he shepherded through Neil Gorsuch's nomination to the Supreme Court. He managed to get folks to line up behind that, and it was a tough sell for a lot of those folks. The hard part for him right now, I think, is that doing this is happening in the context of everyone going home and having town meetings. Mm-hmm. And I think the context of those town meetings is really going to shape how folks come back to Washington. I mean, if folks are hearing from a lot of really angry constituents, it's going to be tough for them to go in and vote for this bill when they've heard from the folks who are going to be voting for them that they don't like it.
So, there was, I don't know if you would say surprise, if you will, but we knew right before the recess for the week that, okay, kind of a halt was put on it. But you seem to think that there might be some movement in the coming weeks.
I think there's definitely a possibility for movement in the Senate. Here comes the problem. So the two houses, House and Senate, have to approve the same bill in identical form. So I think I'm optimistic to some extent that there may be a compromise in the Senate that would lead to a bill. I think the likelihood of the House and the Senate agreeing on a final compromise product is probably pretty low. Because right now, the House Freedom Caucus has basically said, we don't want to have any changes to what we've passed. There was a tough sell to get them on board. They're happy with what they've got, and they don't want to change it. Well, the Senate essentially said that bill was mean, and they would like to change it. And so now, if we're in this situation, if the Senate does come back with a compromise, I'm not sure it's going to be palatable for folks who are in the House.
It's funny, we're kind of seeing similar parallels to what's going on here with the General Assembly with the House and Senate.
But interesting segue on that front, because I think if this were to pass, this would make the discussions we've had in the state about the car tax, about free tuition, pale in comparison. The amount of money we're talking about is significantly greater. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars for Rhode Island. I mean, we're arguing a lot about, you know, tens of millions right now. And as we look down the road, if Medicaid was to substantially scale back, that is a massive hit for the state's budget.
Do you think the state's prepared? I mean, there was a sense of knowing something could be coming. As you said, car tax and free college were sort of the hot topic issues. Clearly, we saw what happened with the budget. But, you know, we don't know if or when they're coming back. And, you know, even if they do come back and don't even address any of these issues about shortfalls of what we could see from D.C., is 6 months, you know, 4 months, depending on how quickly things move down there, a lot of time. Are they going to be able to react here, do you think, in your estimation, if something significant is passed in D.C.?
The good news is that most of the cuts will not happen until after 2018, and that's not an accident because we have a midterm congressional election happening then. Most of what we're looking at is really going to affect us starting in 2020.
Okay.
So I think there is time. Am I optimistic that we will get ahead of that in terms of planning? Not necessarily. So I think we tend to favor Band-Aid solutions as opposed to long-term fiscal planning, so I think that might be a tough sell.
So talk to us about your role at Providence College. You're here as the expert on the ACA. We wanted you to come in and talk with us. But, you know, what's your summer and semester going to look like in terms of balancing, obviously, your academic duties and then being that person who gets to come out and tell us everything that's going on inside DC?
Well, I'm trying to, you know, what I try to do at PC is I teach in the Health Policy and Management program, and we try to bring into our classes kind of the real world context of what's happening out there. And that's what, it's an exciting time. It's an unsettling time because, you know, the ground is literally shifting under your feet. But I think for students entering the field, it's really exciting because healthcare is more prominent now than it's ever been.
And you're seeing, you know, tell us, what do you see from the students when they come in? Why are they getting into the field?
I think many of them correctly understand that you know, we're an aging society, and that as we age, the healthcare system is more important. People recognize that healthcare it's been kind of like the golden goose. Yeah, we're creating jobs where a lot of other industries are not. And this really actually ties into some of the impacts here. Because as we're looking at cutbacks in Medicaid, one thing to remember is always that you know, one person's costs are another person's income. Mm-hmm. And so as we cut Medicaid, that often has a spillover effect, particularly for nursing homes, because Medicaid is the biggest payer for nursing homes. And they're really worried about both of these bills because both of them have a similar target, which is reduce Medicaid dramatically over the course of the next 10 years. If that happens, then what we're looking at most likely are staffing reductions and real challenges here in an industry that has been growing rapidly. And we're seeing this here in Rhode Island. We're talking about having an innovation economy. We're talking about, you know, really using the hospital as an engine, you know, to grow the economy. That's real tough if we're cutting back on the payments to those hospitals.
So I know we're talking about things happening real time and incorporating that in the classroom, but you know, if you put on your academic hat and you look at the Affordable Care Act, and I don't want to say give it a letter grade, but from its inception to where it is today, has it worked?
I think if I had to give it a letter grade, I'd give it a C. I think it's actually done a lot of the things that it had hoped to do on the access front. We've actually brought a lot of people into the system. The problem, and the reason I'd give it a C, is that we've not controlled costs effectively. And I think that's really where the Republican push has been, is they're frustrated that the ACA has cost much more in terms of subsidies and Medicaid expansion than they had initially wanted. Many Democrats are frustrated with it as well because they don't feel it has gone far enough. And so I think there's a lot of room to tweak the current bill. The notion of just essentially repealing it without a replacement is really troublesome. And part of that is because people count on this in a lot of different ways. Folks who are seeking insurance count on it to get their medical care. Providers count on it for revenue. Insurers are counting on it for subsidies to help people buy those policies. And so if we're going to do something, we need to do it in a planned way. And to go back to something you said, we need to give people time and time to plan.
Time to plan, time to anticipate. And as you said, you'd be very surprised if the House ends up accepting kind of what comes out of the Senate. Could we get to the end of the calendar year and still have a stalemate?
I think we absolutely could, in which case the Affordable Care Act remains the law of the land. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the interesting twists here is that Republicans have pledged for 7 years to get rid of this. And now they're in the driver's seat. They're governing, or trying to. And so if at the end of the first year, which is really your golden hour in terms of being able to get something done, they haven't been able to pass anything that would substantially change it or repeal it, I think we're likely to see the Affordable Care Act going pretty much in its current form as far as the eye can see, because I think the midterm elections in 2018 are going to be a tough one for the Republicans.
Well, if that's the case, if there is no action, clearly we know there's political ramifications here. So yeah, so you're saying if we see no action by the end of 17, Democrats claiming it as a win.
They're going to try to claim it as a win. The problem is, one of the things that Republicans are pointing to is rising premiums on a lot of our health insurance marketplaces, places like HealthSource Rhode Island, where we're seeing, not so much here in Rhode Island, but in other states, massive pullouts by insurers like Aetna and Anthem, Humana, who have been real partners in this new system. They're essentially throwing up their hands and saying, we're losing money by the hundreds of millions. We can't continue to do this anymore. And there are some areas in the U.S. now where you have one insurer. Well, that's not a competitive marketplace, and it's really hard to sustain that.
And do you think that, as we talk about the difference with the House and Senate approaches and the Republican approach to have sort of market-based reforms, would the market be able to take care of itself?
I think healthcare really does require a regulated market. You can have competition, but you have to have competition just like we do in any sport. There have to be boundaries. We have to know where the sidelines are. One of the big questions here for us is the issue of pre-existing conditions. Mm-hmm. Hundreds of thousands of Rhode Islanders, for example, are affected by this. And so in the old system, insurers could use pre-existing conditions as a way to either not offer people coverage or to charge them a lot more. Mm-hmm. The Affordable Care Act created a national playing field, level playing field, where we limited that. Many of the Republican plans that were being discussed, including the two bills right now, would let the states experiment. And the Republicans really want to go back to the state level and allow federalism to kind of play out. That creates potentially uneven playing fields. And so people who, for example, have diabetes in one state might pay very different premiums than people who have diabetes in another state. And so I think those provisions are really quite popular with the public. The public wants to protect folks from discrimination on the basis of health. But the insurance companies are arguing they need more flexibility because they're losing money. So there's two sides to the coin.
So what do you think of that in your estimation? If the state control kind of comes to Rhode Island in that sense, how to address folks with pre-existing conditions. Are the states equipped to be able to handle that well? We
already do, actually. The Health Insurance Commissioner here in Rhode Island actually has been very active historically. Chris Kohler really spearheaded that effort when he was here, and I expect the new commissioner to do the same. The legislature has been very active. We have a lot of insurance mandates here in the state, things like coverage from Lyme disease treatments and all sorts of carve-outs, if you will, for ensuring that certain populations are well treated. So I definitely think Rhode Island would be in the forefront of trying to make sure that patients were protected. I think what you're going to see, though, is a lot of other states are less so, and that raises lots of issues of fairness.
So we're all eyes on D.C., kind of seeing what happens after the break. I mean, clearly we'll find out what happens when it happens, but what should folks really be keeping an eye on?
I think the thing for me, and what I'm watching most, is what's the feedback from those town hall meetings that we're seeing, because I think that's going to tell us an awful lot. If just like we were all watching the results of that Georgia House election, to try to get a sense of what was going to happen, and now as we start to see going on, across the country, legislators sitting down with voters, our folks, particularly in those swing districts, Are they getting pushed hard to go in one direction or another? There may be a situation where lots of folks are coming back and voters are not sending a clear message, in which case the legislators are going to have a little bit more leeway.
Then they'll have to make up their minds themselves as to what's best for their
Absolutely.
constituents. Well, Bob Hackey, I appreciate your coming in today to talk with us a little bit
It's a
about
pleasure.
what's going on with the healthcare world. Again, professor at Providence College, knows all about the Affordable Care Act, talking about what we might see coming out from DC moving forward. So hopefully we'll talk with you soon, Professor.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I'll let you go around the corner.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Professor Bob Hackey, woo, from Providence College, here to talk about what's going on inside the Beltway with could possibly happen with healthcare. And as he pointed out, things to watch. Watch more what's happening outside the Beltway with the Congress on break right now, going back to town hall forums, talking with folks, getting feedback, and we'll see what happens in the Senate coming back. Bob Hackey at